Hello, everyone, and welcome. Good afternoon to our East Coast viewers. Good morning to our West Coast viewers. We are going to give it just about a minute to give people a chance to log on. We have over 10,800 people who have registered for today's webinar, Housing First and Faith-Based Organizations. So we are really excited about this conversation. We have an action-packed agenda, and we will get started in about 30 seconds. So again, welcome to everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. And the National Low Income Housing Coalition has put our agenda up for you to review. So my name is Dr. Bambi Hayes Brown, and I am the President and Chief Executive Officer of Georgia Advancing Communities Together, also known as Georgia ACT, and I also serve on the National Low Income Housing Coalition Board of Directors. I am a person with lived experience housing insecurity and also a former public housing resident and a licensed and ordained minister. So I am proud to be your moderator today. And welcome to the sixth webinar in our series of webinars on homelessness and housing first, hosted by the National Low Income Housing Coalition, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. The webinar series promotes best practices in homelessness, like Housing First, and to help combat those efforts in states and localities to criminalize people experiencing homelessness. So a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Please put your questions for the panelists in the Q&A box. So again, please put those questions in the Q&A box. We will not be checking the chat for questions. So please enter those into the Q&A box. And I'm so glad to see so many people from around the country that are putting in the chat where they are from. I also want to remind everyone that we will send a recap of today's webinar with links to the presentation slides and recordings to everyone who registered for the call. So because we have a lot on our agenda, we will go ahead and get started. During today's webinar, we will discuss how faith-based organizations play a very key and vital role in local homelessness response systems by establishing and operating rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing programs consistent with Housing First. Our panelists will talk about how the principles that serve as foundation for Housing First, such as the belief in the dignity and autonomy of individual persons and the idea that all people, regardless of their faith, deserve to have their basic needs met, aligned with our faith in the faith-based institutions. We will be joined by Kim Boudreau, the CEO of Catholic Charities of Acadiana, Jesse Rabonowitz, the Senior Manager for Policy and Advocacy at Miriam's Kitchen in Washington, D.C., and Bonnie Harper, a HUD grant housing specialist at Partners Health Management in North Carolina. And so our speakers will go in that order. And then after our speakers present, we will have a panel discussion. So again, please put your questions in the Q&A section. Finally, we will have Steve Burke, the Chief Policy Officer from the National Alliance to End Homelessness, who will provide us with some updates from Capitol Hill and discuss how advocates can take action in their support of Housing First and robust homelessness funding. So before we get started with our speakers, we will hear from Representative Emanuel Cleaver, who is serving his 10th term representing Missouri's 5th Congressional District. Representative Cleaver serves as ranking member on the House Financial Services Subcommittee on Housing and Insurance. We are grateful for his unwavering support and commitment to addressing the needs of the lowest income Americans and his steadfast support for federal affordable housing and homelessness programs. So next we will cue up the video with Representative Cleaver.
Hello. It is an honor to join the National Low Income Housing Coalition, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities for this month's webinar, exploring how faith-based groups play a vital role in addressing local homelessness systems. Having pastored one of Kansas City's largest churches for more than 38 years, I know the critical role that faith-based organizations play in addressing houselessness in our communities, from a housing first approach that centers on the dignity of those served. As I've said before, and I'll say it again, housing is at the core of our sense of somebodyness. It provides every person with a sense of safety and a place to call their own, giving them purpose and greater opportunity to fulfill their potential. As somebody who spent their formative years in a shack and then in public housing, I understand completely how vital it is for housing programs to reach those most in need, and to do so with compassion, understanding, and in a way that puts the individual's safety and security first. Faith-based groups play a unique but important role on the ground in local communities, as many have already forged trusted relationships. Hello. It is an honor to be in public housing. I understand completely how vital it is for housing programs to reach those most in need, and to do so with compassion, understanding, and in a way that puts the individual's safety and security first. Faith-based groups play a unique but important role on the ground in local communities, as many have already forged trusted relationships.
Please excuse our technical difficulties. We will, if we cannot get it started, we can send this video out with Representative Cleaver. So it is, we like to thank Representative Cleaver for his unwavering support. And next, I will turn it over to Kim, followed by Jesse, and then Bonnie. So take it away, Kim.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. My name is Kim Boudreau, and I'm the CEO of Catholic Charities of Acadiana in South Louisiana. It's been the joy of my life to spend the last 22 years as a practitioner and an administrator of a multi-service faith-based organization. Our services in homeless and housing services will span from the whole spectrum, from street outreach to a hygiene center. We operate a soup kitchen. We are working coordinated entry, homeless prevention, diversion. We have low barrier emergency shelters, both congregate and non-congregate, a VA low demand shelter, VA bridge housing, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, and we're the COC HMIS lead. So our homeless services cover a broad span of services, and we have been working in that space for, in our homeless services now for close to 50 years. Our organization also encompasses services outside of homelessness and housing. That includes immigration legal services, disaster relief and recovery, the Deaf Action Center, low-income housing rehabilitation, and food nutrition services. Over the years, we have considered ourselves as early adopters of practices, of emerging practices, trying to identify what works and what doesn't work. I'm willing to do just about anything, and no, not just about anything, but we've been willing to try different programs as these new concepts have emerged over the years. And we've also been willing to discontinue programs that we didn't see as being effective. And as we follow national policy and best practices, we have discontinued, I feel like, as many programs as we have begun. Over the years, when I first started 22 years ago, we were the largest provider of transitional housing in our region. And we were doing things that today are new, but back then we had a hotel that we operated as non-congregate transitional shelter for families. And we operated transitional housing for single adults as well. And we're part of that transition towards Housing First in those early days. And actually, before we even knew that Housing First was considered a new practice, we were housing our hardest to house individuals directly into housing because they didn't, sheltering didn't work for them. And that Housing First was the best approach for us with those individuals. And we saw the success back, our efforts were successful way back before there was any guidance or help to navigate the complexities of Housing First programs. We ended up making the decision to discontinue our transitional housing programs many years ago. And, and that was a challenging time for us because we had spent so much money and resources and acquiring this property and converting it into the building that it was. But we saw that, a 2-year program trying to get people prepared to be housed or successfully housed, that, after stabilizing them in a shelter environment, we were transitioning them back into housing, which disrupted their stability. Oftentimes they were having to be transitioned to another part of the community or a different city where they had to learn how to navigate new bus routes. The children oftentimes had to change schools. Their employment opportunities were different. And so it was almost like we were having to restabilize people after working with them for 2 years in a shelter. And so we, when Housing First became kind of a national trend, it just made so much sense to us as practitioners. As a faith-based organization, we recognize that God has made us in his image and he knows us intimately. We believe that every person from conception to natural birth has an inherent dignity and a right to life that's consistent with that dignity. And we have to respect each member of this human family. One of my favorite quotes from Pope Francis that he has offered us is that I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it's been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and clinging to its own security. I think that was one of his early quotes as his time with us as our Pope. And it was something that we identified with as a faith-based organization working out in the streets. And as a community, we have an obligation to ensure that every person has sufficient opportunities for his or her integral development. And we know that we have to respect the dignity of people in all circumstances. And I think that that's important to recognize that every person has the right for their basic needs to be met. And for us to expect that we can't expect successful employment, success in school, success in any other aspect of their life would be, it is unrealistic in a sense when someone is in a state of crisis without their basic needs being met in food and housing, sleep and safety, some of those most basic human needs. And so if we at a very basic level as faith-based organizations recognize the inherent dignity of the human person. We also have to recognize that their human needs must first be met. Food, shelter, clothing, sleep, and safety. And many of us, I mean, there's 1.4 thousand on this call, and many of us do work directly with people that are experiencing homelessness. And over the years, I have grown to appreciate, the trauma that someone experiences when they don't have their basic needs, the crisis that they're in, the need for their thoughts are on how do I survive this day? How do I meet my basic needs today? You can't have a meaningful conversation with someone that is in crisis about their future, about their hopes and dreams, about having a life of fulfillment until you meet those basic human needs. After we meet those basic human needs, we move to, the Maslow hierarchy of needs that was designed or developed back in the 40s and 50s that talk about a sense of belonging, that sense of community, the friendships, and that those connections in the community that then leads to that personal self-esteem, the respect for ourselves and the respect for each other, the dignity of ourselves. We're starting to be able to recognize the dignity of ourselves, and that we can recognize the respect for others. Once those things are met, we move to those growth needs of self-actualization, where we can talk about creativity, sense of meaning, purpose, and our inner potential. And so, but we have to go back to the foundational principles of recognizing the dignity of the human person, honoring that sacred gift of human life, meeting those basic needs before we can talk to someone about their future. Moving to a housing first model, I will agree with the sentiment that the housing first work has not been fully funded at a federal level to have the success that I think we all believe that it could. Having the capacity to hire adequate staff that have the professional background to provide the supports that are oftentimes needed and especially in permanent supportive housing, those supports when we're housing someone that has experienced a long period of homelessness. We have, back when I first started, there were people that had been on the streets of our community for 20, 30 years. Our Vietnam veterans had still been on the streets. And it wasn't until this housing first model that we actually started creating housing plans for people that had been unsheltered for decades. And I would always say, I believe everyone can be housed, but there were a few people in the community that I felt like, okay, I don't know if this one will work, but we can try. And then sure enough, every person that we worked with to house, people 20, 30 years on the streets, we successfully moved into housing. This work spans over decades. But it requires the work of professional staff that have the training that's needed, that have the skills that are needed to provide the quality of services that are needed. We housed someone that had been on the streets for so long that it was hard for him to recognize, living in housing again. And so, he slept on his front porch. We would consider that a success, where he slept on his front porch for a few weeks. And then we opened up the front door, and he slept on his front door he slept on his porch with his front door open for a few weeks. And then we moved him inside the living room, left the front door open. And then eventually we closed it, and he slept on the sofa. And going down to these very basic, steps to help somebody reintegrate back into housing. We were unsure if he would be able to remain in housing considering the severity of his conditions. But with the quality services that were able to be provided to him, he remained in housing for the remaining years of his life. And he died peacefully in his home, which is the reality of many people that we serve, is that they, oftentimes will, because we're prioritizing people that are medically vulnerable and have high acuity levels, that oftentimes they will pass away after their house, but we consider that to be a success, that someone died with the dignity of being in their own home rather than being on the streets. I also think that we're greatly challenged with the availability of deeply affordable housing, especially in communities like ours that have been devastated by natural disasters. And we have great barriers there, which, again, we need more investment in. But the principle of housing first, I have a hard time understanding the controversial nature, especially from faith-based communities that represent such a large portion of our homeless providers across the nation, where oftentimes the service providers that do recognize Christ faced in the distressing disguise of the poor were the ones that feel called to that service. And so I think that our faith compels us to a compassionate service that recognizes that basic needs need to be met first. Housing, one of the most prominent of those needs. All other goals can come from that. I'll switch it, hand it back to Dr. Brown.
Thank you so much, Kim. And we have begun to receive several questions in the Q&A panel. So thank you so much. And we will hear back from you very soon. So next we'll turn it over to Jesse.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Jesse Rabinowitz, and I work at Miriam's Kitchen. Miriam's Kitchen is a homeless services organization based in DC that has embraced the Housing First model. And I'll tell you a little bit more about our story when we move to the next slide. And one more after that. Perfect. So Miriam's was founded. This is our 40th year anniversary. As you can see, we have all sorts of volunteers come through, from people to like Michelle Obama to anyone who wants to come volunteer. We serve breakfast, lunch, breakfast and dinner to about 300 people a day. And our foundation story is really a story of how faith-based groups have come together to support our neighbors living outside. Miriam started through a collaboration through Western Presbyterian Church, the GW Jewish Student Association, and another faith-based organization who realized that in the mid-'80s, there was a huge influx of people staying outside and they needed their basic needs met. And from that, we have grown from 2 part-time staff to an organization of over 100 people, providing homeless street outreach, permanent supportive housing, wraparound case management, and advocacy to push our city towards our shared goal of ending homelessness. One of the things I really find interesting about Miriam's Kitchen's history is that when we were getting our soup kitchen started, one of the council members said, and this is in DC, which claims to be a progressive community, one of the council members said, "Over my dead body, are you going to serve homeless people in my neighborhood?" And the church we're based out of said, "It's a tenet of our faith that we minister to folks who need help. And you telling us that we can't serve food here is a violation of our free practice of religion." And it went, there were court cases about it, and we won. And 20, 30 years later, we are still open and serving folks, and more folks than we have ever before. So that's really great, but I think it shows that faith-based communities have such a huge role in this, and are integral to doing this work. I will say that Miriam's has been around during the Housing Last era, and we know that it didn't work. People were not staying in housing. People, it was rare that someone would get a voucher. And when someone got a voucher, they weren't able to maintain their housing because they weren't able to maintain their sobriety or go to the doctor or get a job or things like that. Now, DC has largely embraced a housing first model, though we do have a few holdouts. And we know that it works. 90 between 95 and 97% of people in DC in permanent supportive housing stay housed after their first year, which shows us that housing with the right wraparound services works to end homelessness. And just from an efficacy standpoint, it works better than requiring people be sober and receive services. So we're seeing day in and day out that we're ending homelessness through the Housing First model, and it works to keep folks safe and stably housed. Let's move to the next slide. So we run a large advocacy campaign in DC called the Way Home Campaign, which brings together 110 organizations and about 7,000 individual voters to support budgets that end homelessness. As we speak, we're working on our budget campaign right now. The DC Council votes on the budget tomorrow. And we have found that it is incredibly important to mobilize and to activate our faith leaders. So many of our campaign partners are faith leaders. Here you see pictures of different pastors testifying in front of the DC Council, meeting with council members, holding rallies at their churches. We've learned that religious institutions enable us to provide this moral argument and backing that they are able to make the case to our elected officials that if you want a budget to be a moral document and that budget does not fund things that end homelessness, you've missed the mark. We also know that organizing in faith communities really enables us to bring people power, right? Saul Alinsky, one of the early organizers out of the Chicago School of Organizing, really talked about the importance of mobilizing faith-based communities because they had butts in seats. It was an easy way to energize people, and organizing faith-based institutions to do local policy advocacy is incredibly successful, and there's a huge bang for your buck. There's also institutional power that comes with it. When an organization that is known as a faith leader in the community goes to the mayor and says, we want X, we want Y, we want housing, that carries a different weight than when a non-faith-based organization says those same things. And there's also a credibility. People really do trust clergy members in a way that they don't trust regular community members. So some of the ways we've done this are through writing letters, focus on asking the mayor to fund a moral budget. We had dozens of faith-based institutions sign a sign-on letter to the mayor. And unfortunately, she didn't listen to our advocacy, but it doesn't mean we're going to stop trying. We also have relationships with the clergy at several of the council members' congregations. So they will sometimes come with us on lobby visits and remind them that their faith tradition compels them to help people who are experiencing homelessness. Let's move. I wanted to move a little bit onto some textual stuff. So I'm in an interesting place that my professional job is being an organizer, working to end homelessness in DC. But in a previous life, I was a Jewish social justice educator. And I always like to, whenever I can, connect those two things. So I wanted to spend a minute kind of looking at, from a textual lens, what Judaism has to say about housing first. And I pulled two different sources, and I'm going to put them on the screen and I'm going to read them out loud. And I'm just curious to hear in the chat or through the comments, like how this lands with people. But I want you to come away with the knowledge that Judaism really is a religion that supports choice and autonomy, and in that vein supports housing first. So we have this first text. If there is a needy person among you, do not harden your heart and shut their hand against the needy. Rather, you must open your hand and lend them sufficient for whatever they need. Give to them readily with no regrets when you do so, for in return, God will bless you in all your efforts and all your undertakings. We often, as I'm sure many folks on this call get asked all the time who do this work, what should I do when someone asks for money? And I always point them back to this text, maybe not directly to the text, but to remind them that when you give money, when the money leaves your hand, the judgment ends, right? You give people what you can, and that's where the judgment ends, and that's where the work ends, and you trust people to know that they are going to use the money for whatever purposes they need. And I think that really ties into the housing first approach as well. We often hear that people don't need housing or aren't going to use housing for all of these reasons that we know actually are not true. But I think it's important that we are able to ground ourselves in the fact that we trust people enough to make the decisions that are best for them. And we know that those decisions are best made when they come from a place of safety and stability and of a home. The next slide gets into a bit more of a little esoteric text. This is a Jewish text from like the 1480s, and it's a compilation of laws. And this one I love. It really talks about you give the person what they need and what they were accustomed to getting before they entered into poverty. If someone was baking their own bread dough, give them dough. If someone was sleeping in a bed, give them a bed. If someone was accustomed to eating warm bread from the oven, make sure they have bread from the oven. If one needs to be spoon-fed, feed them. And then it also says if a formerly wealthy person was accustomed to ride on a horse with a slave running behind him, then his fortune changed and he became impoverished, we should, if possible, obtain for him a horse and a servant. It also at the end talks about the importance of having a home and a proper bedroom and furniture and utensils as a jumping off point for marriage, which textually we would see as like stability and family relationships. But to me, it's very clear that we need to treat people with dignity and respect, and that means treating people to make the choices, their best choices. And if people are saying, you know, I want a house, or I want a bed, or I want an apartment, I want somewhere that's safe, and I don't want to jump through all these hoops, and I want a housing first model, that is what my faith-based tradition compels us to do. So I will stop there. I'm looking forward to having some robust conversations, and I want to give a shout out to all the other panelists who are working in states where there is not a prevailing housing first push, and just know that y'all are really doing such important work to bring the whole country around to a housing first approach, because that's what we need to end homelessness in the country.
Thank you so much, Jesse, and we look forward to hearing from you again once we get to our discussion section. Next, we'll hear from Bonnie. Take it away, Bonnie.
Good afternoon. My name is Bonnie Harper. I am a HUD grant housing specialist with Partners Health Management. I manage the Permanent Supportive Housing Grant. Next slide, please. I would like to open up with a quote, and because I believe the faith-based organizations that I work with believe this too. And it's Luke 4:18. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recover the sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free. I work with several faith-based organizations, but I've chosen 3 in particular today because when I worked at a homeless agency in the past, I really got to know the pastors and the apostles and the individual that is doing life coaching. And each one of these faith-based organizations, the Pastor Kyle and Wendy DeLong, who do the Church of Nazarene, they are persons in long-term recovery, and they've been homeless before. And then the Supernatural Acts of God's Worship Center, the Apostle Ivy and Raymond Highwater also have lived experience. And so they know what the path looks like, and they have compassion. And the other thing that is very nice too is and I think we take this for granted, everybody assumes that all members in churches are ready for us to bring our population into faith-based organizations. And I tend to disagree with that. And I believe that these faith-based organizations did a great job preparing the way to bring in the lost and the broken. So the Church of the Nazarene does several things in the community and work with not only my PSH clients, but all that are in need. So they work with the reentry, and they work in 3 different programs in prisons. They do the Day One with God, which is actually, if you're not familiar with that, I would like to encourage you to look that up. It's helping families, especially children, bond with their family members, their fathers in the prisons, and they sponsor that for a day. They pick up individuals and bring them to church. They actually will take them to appointments. They've helped them move. If they need any detoxing, they will do that as well. They really bring the clients in and they show them what true agape love is. And as we know, the population that we work with, they don't understand that they can be loved just how they are, where they're at, and no judgment. Next slide, please. The other person that we work with is Miss Tina Nicole Moore, and she is a Heart and Souls life coaching and she just started her business, and she does a lot of free consolation and counseling with individuals with our program, along with anybody else that may be in need. She has life experience as well. She's had DV situations 2 times, and she actually right now has a child that is homeless and still using. So she is a wonderful resource for individuals that are going through the same thing she is, and she really understands that. The other church that we use is the Supernatural Acts of God's Worship Center, and they are in Newton and in Vale. And they also have a nonprofit called In My Father's House, and they provide clothing and food and any household items. They will also, if somebody's in a crisis and they just need somebody to talk to, they will go over and they will sit and console them, because the individuals that we are working with are very broken, and they don't trust anybody, and they need to say and express themselves without being judged. And I feel that this is a very safe place for them. We have had several of the PSH clients join the churches. They volunteer and they give back, and they're extremely happy, and they understand. And now they really feel, once again, like I said, the agape love, loving wholly, unconditionally, non-judgment. Don't expect somebody to be perfect. And I am so pleased that we are finally having this conversation about bringing faith-based organizations in, because we have to have tough, uncomfortable conversations. And I know a lot of the different types of religions have different beliefs and stuff, but realistically, when you do God's work, there is no judgment. You are to meet the individual where they're at, and you are to walk alongside them, holding their hand throughout all of that without condemnation. And that is really, and Jesus, I just saw something a little bit, Jesus has no barriers. Jesus moves you along and he holds you and goes all the way. So I would like to close with a scripture as well. And this one is Proverbs 31:8-9. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. As Christians, and I'm going to throw that in there, as Christians, you don't have a choice. You help people where they're at. You don't judge them. You help them and you guide them and you support them. And I believe the Housing First program is exactly what Jesus does. He holds your hand and he moves you forward, and we just let them choose and we support them in all that they do.
Thank you all so much for your respective insights on your organizations and your beliefs. We did have a very robust question and answer section here. We've had so many questions here. We have about 15 minutes. We're going to try to get to as much of them as we can. So we're going to ask all of our panelists if you would come off of come back on camera, and we will start with the first question that seems to be a recurring one. So for those who are elderly, disabled, traditionally marginalized communities and individuals that need housing, how can faith-based institutions help people who need housing navigate what can be very complex housing systems? So how can faith-based institutions help in that arena? So I'll turn it over to anyone who wants to answer. Kim?
I'm wondering if anybody else is going to take the question. Can you repeat the beginning of that question? So I'm sure.
Yeah, so there's elderly, disabled, people who may have evictions on their credit, traditionally marginalized individuals also hold a real estate license, broker's license, and I see so many times where when I'm trying to help people navigate into housing, they may require 3-4 times the rent, first month's rent, last month's rent, all of that. And then there's a shortage of vouchers, which is something that we advocate for at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, for robust funding for universal vouchers. But in the meantime, how can faith-based institutions help people navigate those systems with HUD, or maybe with a local municipality or with the state that may have those vouchers or other housing sources? How can faith-based institutions help people navigate those institutions so that they can receive the services?
Right. So I know that in our organization, our housing support, our housing supports and our case management is really geared towards those experiencing homelessness, and that our organization doesn't have the resources to provide it to the broader public. But I know that there are other organizations in the community, including those that are faith-based, that do housing navigation services. Because it is much more complicated than I think many people that haven't gone through those processes can assume, especially if you're dealing with a housing voucher or trying to sit with a landlord and you have challenges with your credit or any kind of criminal history. We see a lot of housing discrimination take place that maybe isn't obvious on the surface, but we do see those housing discrimination issues surface, especially, for people that you have just listed. And so I think that, communities of faith can offer, even if you're not part of an organization, can offer kind of that support at the local community level, at the church level, community level, to identify members of the community that are having challenges with their housing, to try to accompany them through those processes, help them with transportation, help them with sometimes computer applying for these applications online or barriers. I think that accompaniment at the lowest level possible, as we value, subsidiarity and trying to meet those needs closely to the origin of those needs as possible. But I think that that's a great area of work for faith-based communities to be engaged in.
Thank you so much. And we have thousands of individuals here on the webinar. So if you have something that you would like to add or answer, please feel free to put that in the chat. I'm sure your colleagues would like to hear or read those answers as well. So we could go ahead to the next question. We have several questions here. So how would you, as a faith-based institution, some of our institutions have hierarchies and some are independent, and some may have some conflicts of doctrine. of individuals. We've seen some questions as it relates to sobriety, our siblings in the LGBTQIA community. So how would you navigate those housing first and housing individuals with your institution if it has some type of conflict in the doctrine?
This is fine. With partners, we do not discriminate against any of that. And we don't force any religion on anybody. If the client is wanting services, the churches that I work with don't look at any of that stuff. And you have to find what the client is looking for. And if they're going to feel uncomfortable and judging, you should never put them in that situation. So I think we need to be very mindful of that, because they don't need more trauma. And we don't need to add anything else to that. So we need to take and listen to the clients on where they want to go and what they want to do. And we need to be very mindful of that.
Thank you. And there's also been some robust discussion about that in the chat as well. So our next question, any effects on NIMBYism in communities, and do you have any recommendations around zoning and density in your respective communities that could encourage housing first? As what are some solutions? I know someone had mentioned a guaranteed income that we're seeing in several communities. We've had that piloted here in Georgia as well.
I can try, or I can shed some DC context on that. But first, I wanted to just apologize and admit that I super messed up in my slides. I should have explained the difference. There was a quote about slavery and biblical slavery, and that being different than, transatlantic slavery, and I am just very sorry about that. I will note that one of the actually cool things in the text, if you look in the Hebrew, it says if the person's accustomed to having a slave, then provide them with a servant. It doesn't say provide them with a slave. It says provide them with a paid person to meet their needs. So I think inherently in the text, it's recognizing that slavery is not good. And that's not what the text is pointing towards. It's actually pointing to ensure that the person has their needs met through a paid employee, which I think is neat. But I just wanted to name that I should have said more about that, and I am very sorry, and that was not okay. And I appreciate folks in the chat for calling me out. So thank you. In DC, we need Congress. If we want to build density, we actually need Congress to change our laws, because DC has a congressionally enforced height restriction. So it really, to us, comes down to building power, both on the local and national levels, and DC doesn't have statehood. So whereas most other states would be able to make that change at the state level, we need Congress to make that change for us. So this is my pitch to our national friends to push for DC statehood. But one of the ways the faith-based communities are building power is by having these conversations in their sanctuaries, in their churches, on Sundays and Saturdays and days of their worship, and really building a base of people who can do this advocacy. And actually, one of our closest partners, Foundry United Methodist Church, developed this incredible model where they have a partnership with a state with a very powerful Republican senator, and they kind of made a deal with them that they would push their church in that southern state to push for DC statehood, and Foundry in DC would deliver letters to the senator's office on their behalf. So using our proximity to power and using their proximity to a voting member of Congress was actually a really creative way to build power and expand the housing first. But I think, to me, it comes down to building power and building political will, and that comes down to grassroots organizing. And there's no better place to do that than in faith-based communities.
Thank you. And Kim, do you have something you would like to add with our previous question?
Sure. I wanted to go back to the previous about conflicts with the doctrine of the faith community that you represent, and the challenges that it may that you may face as a provider of homeless services. And I just want to say, as a organization, a faith-based organization that feels called to honor the sacred gift of all human life, that includes the life of those that are LGBTQ, and in particular, you know, in a special way, there are not many people who are transgender in our community, but those that are disproportionately face economic hardship and homelessness as a result of maybe rejection from their families, and from discrimination in the workplace. And so that is a community that we have encountered for many years within our homeless systems. And we have had a special place in our hearts for just the grief that they've experienced. And so I think that showing mercy and compassion to people that, you know, of all walks of life is what we are called to witness to. Our organization for a long time, before it was federally mandated, sheltered people according to the gender they identified with. We found that that was the most respectful and dignified way of offering shelter. You know, we've been called into question over the years over that, and time and time again, you know, we have seen that that's the most dignified way of responding to people. So I just wanted to throw that piece in, as well as addressing the sobriety. You know, I come from Louisiana, where drinking alcohol is just kind of a way of life for us. And I really have a hard time, you know, accepting the pushback that people that are experiencing housing instability shouldn't have the right to enjoy a beer. And I just, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. You know, people that are housed enjoy their wine at night, their beer at night, and I don't understand why there's a different standard for people that are unhoused. The only difference is that those of us that are housed enjoy our wine or our beer in the privacy of our own home. And if we have too many glasses of wine, we have the privacy of our four walls and a door, you know, so that the public doesn't see it. And so I think that we need to be mindful of double standards that we expect of people that we don't expect of ourselves. And I want to go back into just a comment that I think that I've had many faith communities that have come to volunteer with our organization and tried to accompany people experiencing homelessness and trying to get them back into jobs and getting them sober, and, you know, then coming back maybe a month or two later saying, you know, well, we got them clean and sober and they were, you know, getting their lives together, and then they fell off the wagon again. And, you know, as soon as they got paid, they started drinking again. And, you know, you've been doing this for so long, how do you walk long and strong with these people? And I see it as that I have been a recipient of God's mercy, that I'm a sinner. I have failed time and time again, and God has shown me mercy in my life. And as a recipient of God's mercy, I feel compelled to offer that same mercy to people in front of me. And so I think that because God's walked long and strong with me, I'm called to walk long and strong with others, and to offer mercy when people fail. If people sin, maybe they're not sinning the same way that I do, but we have to be a people of compassion, of understanding, of mercy, because that's the God that we know and love. That's it.
Thank you so much, Kim, for that. There's been a lot of discussion here in the chat. You could definitely take a look at that. And we'll go on to our next question. We do have a housing crisis here in our country. And what are some things that can be done to minimize that housing crisis? We've seen where a lot of our lower income housing has been removed in favor of higher income housing, also higher end shops and those types of things. So what do you think from the faith-based community can be done to help minimize those effects of our housing crisis?
I think we can advocate along with our other advocates on Housing First and more resources and money and risk mitigation funding to help the landlords in case damages are done. I think that's something that we really need, we can do, that we can all come together on that.
Great, thank you so much. And advocacy is 365, 24/7, and we need all parties involved in advocacy. Another question there's been a lot of threats to the Housing First and permanent supportive housing model around the country. And people are kind of asking, what's the long-term stats on permanent supportive housing or Housing First 5 years or 10 years out? Or even just anecdotally within your respective organizations, what are some of these, what would you see as the successes of the Housing First model?
I don't have numbers off the top of my head, but I just got back from lunch with someone who's been in Housing First for 20 years. And he is doing great, and we're presenting at a conference together tomorrow. I think we see by and large that many years out, people stay housed in Housing First, and the program works. Does it work for 100% of the community? No, there are some tweaks we need to make. Sometimes people need more support, and I think we should be honest about that. But by and large, it works better than the alternative, which is housing last. And what we see in DC is that most people, the overwhelming majority of people in Housing First, stay in housing for their duration, until they no longer need it anymore. So we see it works incredibly well day in and day out, and we're proud to support Housing First.
I want to add that
Cam? Yes, go right ahead, Cam.
as an organization that's been practicing Housing First for, I'd say officially, probably 15 years, I would say that it takes a commitment, and our organization in particular feels committed to working with the most vulnerable, and oftentimes, and especially in our permanent supportive housing program, which looks at people with the highest acuity, highest vulnerability, people with, that are struggling with their mental wellness, their physical disabilities, and substance use disorders. And, this ties back into scripture in that, we see ourselves in the story of the Good Samaritan. And today, who are those that are lying on the side of the road where no one wants to stop and help, and that everyone crosses the other side of the road and just continues walking? I think that we feel compelled to stop and to assist those people who no one else is willing to help. And so that's the population that we, I feel like, do our best to work with, because we have a sense of determination and a sense of joyfulness in the work that we do. We try not to ever give up on anyone. And in our permanent supportive housing programs, even if our client does face eviction, we take that as a moment to reassess, was that the right housing solution for them? What are modifications that we need to make in rehousing this individual to ensure that the next housing opportunity that we place this person in is successful? Maybe we put them in an apartment, maybe they need a structure where they're not sharing walls with someone. What are the modifications that we need to make so that it's successful the next time? In all the years that we have administered our permanent supportive housing program, we've only dropped one client in all these years where we reached the point where we felt like we couldn't work with that individual. Otherwise, we have continued working with individuals until their death and have subsequently buried them. I would say that because we're prioritizing people that are trimorbid, that we very rarely have people that transition back into out of our PSH roles into just a subsidized housing because of that need for long-term supports. But I know there are other PSH programs within our COC that do have kind of the lower acuity individuals that do in time transition back over into just the general housing subsidy. I think that we have a lot of work to do around affordable housing development in our country, though. There's just not, this is the first time that I've ever seen people with housing subsidies and PSH vouchers in our shelters and on the streets that we can't find housing for them. I've never seen that before, which is affecting our outflow.
And with Partners PSH program, the Housing First model does work. We've actually hosted Patrick McHenry at one of our local agencies, and we got to talk about it. Last year, we moved off 7 people, whether that was with an EHV or on their own. So the Housing First program does work for Partners, and we work closely with other supportive services to assure that they are successful. So when we house them first, you do get a housing coordinator to help guide you through the services and what they need. So whether that's brain health, that's physical health, that might be disability, that's food, we wrap them with those services. And when you do that, they are successful. It doesn't happen overnight. We have to invest in people. And that's one thing where that faith base comes in, is that faith base comes in and is part of that services if they choose to have that. So I am a big proponent, if you are doing housing first and wrapping them around services, that they are successful and they can move off that program and be quite sufficient on their own.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. And I'd like to say, when we talk about faith-based institutions, we're not just talking about Christianity. So we are talking about, even this is a very, very tiny, small representation. And so many of our partners are from small faith-based institutions. One that comes to mind here in Georgia is the beloved Community Development Corporation that opened up a day shelter that treats people with dignity first. And they have washing machines where people can wash their clothes. They have televisions where people can watch TVs. They also have things such as charging stations where people can charge their cell phones and computers to apply for services. And they also have robust partnerships with other groups around the Atlanta area, because their target was bandos. And if you've never heard that that word before, it is abandoned houses that have no running electricity, no water, but people are actually staying there. And they saw a need when they were initially doing food giveaways and food shelters. But if you give a person canned food and don't give them a can opener, that doesn't help. So that just really shaped their philosophy. And they also have NA and AA services available to the people in the Pittsburgh community in Atlanta. So we want you to think more broadly as we talk about faith-based institutions. And also, yes, amen to the can opener. And also this faith-based institution is a strongly Afrocentric institution, but I have gone there and volunteered, and they help anyone that comes through the doors, regardless of race, religion, color, familiar status, whether they're cisgender, LGBTQIA, it doesn't matter. So I think it's important that we keep in mind that we're people centered. And I have noticed and watched the chat, and I think messaging is very important as well. When I was experiencing homelessness, there were some judgment from some people, and we have to understand that things, sometimes bad things can happen to good people, and most of us, and there are quite a few of us here, that may be just one paycheck away from homelessness or being unsheltered. So that was a great point I saw in the chat when we talked about drug addicts. We stay away from those types of words and monikers because that is being judgmental, and we have to keep in mind whatever religion or faith that you are, it is not our business to judge. My question, as I was talking to my staff this morning, because I am a Christian, I was raised conservative Southern Baptist, but my question is, what would Jesus do? And so that's the walk that I walked when I formed my ministry, the Great Commission Institute of Georgia, is to spread the good news and to spread the good news to our people, and also to those who absent of faith. There may be some atheists, there may be some that are agnostic. It doesn't make a difference, and so we have to keep that in mind and also be very much aware of our language. If we want to bring people to Christ, then we got to walk the walk, not just talk the talk, and that people need to see it. See it in us, see it in our actions, and see it in our faith-based institutions. And once they see that, you've already done the preaching or the calling or the prophecy and all of that, because people see the good work that you do and they can feel it, but they can also see if you're not sincere as well. So this is what I say is definitely a calling in this type of work. So again, housing first, but people first, because there is no one size fits all. Okay, and I will jump off of my soapbox here. Do you have any last minute questions? I'll start with you, Bonnie, then Jesse, and then Kim.
I'm just really glad that we're having these tough, uncomfortable conversations, because these are very tough and they are going to make people feel uncomfortable, but we need to have this.
And
Jesse?
This was phenomenal. Thank you so much for pulling this together. I think there were a lot of questions in the chat about, like, why are we talking about faith? Why are we talking about religion? And I think I would just say that we are so blessed to have so many great partners with faith-based organizations. And also, when we see a lot of pushback against Housing First, it is from faith communities. So we wanted to show and continue to show that faith communities support Housing First and have a role in pushing back against the harmful narrative that Housing First doesn't work, because we know it works. It works in DC, it works in California, it works around the country. And we just wanted to show that Housing First and faith traditions are not incompatible, but they actually reinforce each other.
Thank you, Kim.
I would, I think Jesse said it in a great way, that that we see Housing First as a natural complement to our faith, and that our faith-based organizations represent such large, community, a large community of service providers and homeless and housing services. So I think this is an important topic. And one of my favorite quotes is from St. Francis is, preach the gospel always, and if necessary, use words. And I think that, when we're serving the needs of those that don't, that suffer in our communities, it's kind of the test of our authenticity as people of faith. If we're just going to church and, not serving our community and seeking out those that suffer, I think that it calls the authenticity of your faith into question. And so I think that we need to be serving. I think we need to be merciful. and help people get back on the path for better days ahead for them. So that's it. Thank y'all for having this conversation.
Thank you all so much. And I will close, as I have said oftentimes when I am advocating, my job is to comfort the disturbed and to disturb the comfortable. And so I will leave you with that, and I will turn it over to Steve Berg, who will give us, we'll take the next 20 minutes to give us some policy and Capitol Hill updates. So thank you. Take it away, Steve.
All right, thank you, and thank you for everybody coming. We're running a little behind. I'm not going to take 20 minutes, but there are very important things going on over the next couple of weeks. So I want to make sure people know what those are. Steve Berg, the Chief Policy Officer of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. We are partnering with the Low Income Housing Coalition and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities to create this series of webinars, and I hope people are finding it useful. The turnout is great, and we always try to end with some action-oriented discussion of what's going on in Congress. And I tell you, some crazy things are going on in Congress. There's discussion of hitting the debt ceiling. If people are not familiar with this discussion, there's a law that says the federal government can only go a certain amount of dollars into debt, and we're going to hit that amount sometime. Nobody's quite sure, but maybe sometime in early June. And the majority in the House of Representatives has put out a bill that offers to raise the debt ceiling, but insists on big cuts in federal spending as their payoff for cooperating with raising the debt ceiling. We feel like it's extremely important for everybody to be in touch with your members of Congress, whether it's Republicans, Democrats, House, or Senate, to make sure that they are putting the message out there that these federal spending programs for things like the Housing Choice Voucher Program, for the National Housing Trust Fund, for other programs that provide housing and that provide health care and that provide help for people to get jobs. These are what has allowed homelessness to get under control in some of the cities where people are doing the best work. We find that focused investments lead to results. And we've seen over the last couple of years, focused investments for people in families with children who are homeless or on the verge of homelessness, for veterans who are homeless or on the verge of homelessness, for youth who are aging out of foster care, a very vulnerable population. But we've seen focused investments for those groups. And we've seen homelessness drop dramatically for those groups over the last few years. And on the other hand, for groups where there hasn't been the kind of focused investment, like people who are living on the streets with disabilities, we have not seen homelessness go down. So money is important. The cuts in funding that are being proposed by the House majority would be devastating to this kind of work. We need people to be in touch with their members of Congress over the next couple of weeks, because they're looking at having to make some conclusion on the debt ceiling within the next couple of weeks. The other thing, besides just cutting funding, the other thing I want to say that the House majority has proposed is more work requirements, particularly for the Medicaid program, which is the large federal program that pays for health care for the lowest income people in the country. We have examined research over many decades about work requirement programs in healthcare programs, and that the results of that research are consistent over time. They do not lead to more people getting jobs. What they lead to is people getting deprived of health care because they don't keep up with the paperwork requirements, particularly the most vulnerable people, people with mental illnesses, people who are struggling with addictions. This is a group that it's shown over and over again that work requirements don't lead to more jobs. They lead to losing benefits because they can't meet the paperwork requirements. So we're working very hard to bring this message to Congress as well. I think we have we have a paper here. That's what I'm talking about. A take action slide showing what people can do and what some of the tools that people have available if they want to be in touch with your member of Congress. If you don't know people in your member of Congress's staff, you can get to know them. But if you don't already, then you can take some of these actions here. The National Alliance to End Homelessness that I work for has a statement of values opposing criminalization of homelessness and a take action about to help with, how to write a letter, how to write a simple email to your member of Congress, and help getting in touch with the right staff people. The Low Income Housing Coalition has a whole advocacy toolkit about the cuts in spending. The Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding, which is a coalition of groups in Washington, D.C. That we all belong to, has another annual budget letter that calls for more funding. These are some of the tools you can use. We hope everybody uses them, and we are looking forward to having a lot of support for these programs and making sure that Congress doesn't do anything that's going to make the funding situation even worse. We need more money, not less. That's what solves homelessness, and we're working together to get that, and we're happy to have you on board with that too. So let me leave it there and turn it back to Dr. Brown if she's still here.
Yes, I am. Thank you so much on how to get involved. Another way to get involved is to join the National Low Income Housing Coalition. If you are not a member, I encourage you to do so. We have several ways that we can advocate, and this has been a great discussion. And I see that there may be an opportunity for us at the National Low Income Housing Coalition to continue organizing faith-based leaders around the nation around this work. So that may be an opportunity for us. We'll take that back to the staff and the board. And Sister Ahmad, I see you most definitely. Reparations now. I'm a firm believer in reparations. So thank you for always bringing that up. And so thank you to everyone who joined the call. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everyone who put questions and answers in the Q&A, and also lend your expertise in this webinar chat. And so our next webinar, which will be on June the 12th, so go ahead and register, will be the Housing First model and how it supports those who are impacted by the criminal legal system. So that is something that is very, very much needed, even within my own family, having a son who was impacted by the criminal legal system and how it affected his ability to find housing. So that is something that is definitely needed. So we look forward to seeing each and every one of you on June the 12th. Please spread the word. And this recording, as well as the PowerPoint slides, will be sent out to everyone who registered for today's call. And you can find out more information again on the National Low Income Housing Coalition's website. And we got a request. Some people have requested to get the chat. So if you're on a laptop, you can click on those. There are 3 little buttons that says save the chat, and you can definitely do that. So thanks again. We appreciate each and every one of you being here, and all the best. Have a great day.